Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us again for another segment of Speaking of. Today, we have a special guest. And I know I say that every week, and I know I mean it every week, but I mean it a lot this week. Today, sitting across from me, we have Jeff VanderMeer. For those of you who know, you're clapping. For those of you who don't know, in just a short 30 minutes, you'll be clapping too. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, Jeff, let's kick this thing off with a quote from Annihilation. We were neither what we had been nor what we would become once we reached our destination. You haven't reached your destination, but I'm sure at this phase in your career, you're not what you were when you started. And when you're finished, you won't be this.
Yeah.
So a lot like life, let's do a past, present, and future thing, starting with the present and the release of your new novel.
Yeah, Absolution, the fourth Southern Reach book, the fourth book of mine to be set along the Forgotten Coast here in North Florida. And it's got the same ratio of stuff that people from this area will recognize and the weird things they won't. But maybe there's not as much difference between them as you might think. I think what's changed in terms of like how I talk about this place through the medium of these novels is it's actually more direct in this novel. Like if you've been to Wakulla Beach or Mash Sands, you will recognize actual scenes in this book. If you've been to the Panacea Aquarium, you will recognize a room full of jars of dead things. And so it's kind of like even more of like, a love note of a sort to this area and to the people here, too. There's a lot about the people here and the communities as well as the wildlife, all mixed up with this kind of cosmic mystery.
So I've heard that. I read that somewhere. I think it was the New Yorker that said that your books are kind of fragmented, lyrical love letters to the northern mossy coast of Florida, right? And they really are. And so this one will not be different in that way.
Not in that way. In some other ways, like all the research into kind of whacked out CIA experiments of the 70s, all the research into the sea debris reports from the last 70 years, which is kind of interesting that they actually keep those official records of what washes up on shore. And then also just, it's in the title. I mean, it's a lot about characters who either don't know they need forgiveness or are seeking forgiveness for something. And they're all operating within these systems that are already kind of like damaged and flawed and kind of like wreaking havoc on them. And so one thing it's about is about the fact that we often think we have a lot of agency, but we're acted upon by powers beyond our control. And some of them are not that great.
Let me ask you this, Jeff. The title of the book lends itself in some way to completion, right? Or answers. And, nobody critiques, Jeff VanderMeer, but the people who critique him the most,
they sure do,
I know they do. I'm just messing with you. But the people who critique you the most are the people that love you the most, that read you the most from what I've seen. And one of the things I've seen is you're okay with not giving answers. You're okay with leaving things unsaid. I guess I got a two-part question for you. The first part of that question is, will Absolution render any answers to this grand trilogy and now tetralogy?
Yeah, I mean, it will give you some answers, and it'll raise new questions as well. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been on the coast or even hiking anywhere in North Florida and you've like seen something out of the corner of your eye and you don't know what you saw, and by the time you look again, it's not there.
It's not there.
Yeah. That's kind of what the book's about.
I love it.
The unknowability of things. You're never going to know what that thing is. And on a grander scale, for all our science and philosophy and religion, there are things, there's still things we're never, at least in our lifetimes, ever going to know. And so the series is about that. But the amazing, wonderful thing about that is as I have found out, it leaves so much room for the reader's imagination to complete the story. Not the character arcs. The character arcs are always complete, but complete the mystery, like the solutions to the questions. And so if you go online, you'll find people, busily like engaging with each other about what they think that the answer to the mystery is. And so I've been really blessed in that that's how readers have engaged with it. Like they're engaging it with their imagination. They're helping complete the story themselves.
Let me ask you this. I hope I didn't misspeak earlier. Is this now a tetralogy? Is this a fourth of the Southern Reach in, name and act, or is this going to kind of exist on its own?
Well, I mean, there is some synergy to the first three books, basically being about this secret agency, the Southern Reach. Trying to investigate this strange area that's kind of sprung up on the coast. But I'd say Absolution definitely completes that story to some degree. It's kind of a sneaky book because it's touted as a prequel, but it's really a prequel and a sequel and contiguous with the events in the first three books. So I'd been looking for a way of like, how do I extend the story beyond acceptance? And I found a really sneaky way to show you what happens after acceptance with Area X. Although by way of somebody who has a lot of anxiety, is on anxiety drugs, so you can't necessarily trust his point of view, but but that's kind of part and parcel of the series too, right? You never know whether you can trust the point of view of the character you're in, kind of like in true life.
I was going to say exactly like in real life. Let me ask you this. The second part to that question was this not only ability, but this kind of knack to leave things open. Is that a writing tool, or is that how you see life in some ways?
That's a good question. It is both. I mean, this series is about that. So it's actually misplacing the trust from the reader if I solve everything, but also I do believe that, and I believe that we have to be okay with that. We have to make our peace with that, and that there's some wisdom in recognizing the fact that we're not going to ever know everything. I think that when we think we know everything, that's when we get into real trouble. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it goes back to that old quote: "The height of knowledge is knowing that you know nothing."
Right, exactly, but still striving to know as much as you can.
Absolutely.
And I think in other books like my Bourne series, it's the opposite. It's about characters that are trying to connect even in spite of horrible odds, and there is closure, there is an answer. But for this series, and in some ways, how I see North Florida, like even the research for Absolution, like I had a research assistant for the first time because this book just like came out. Like for 6 months, I did nothing but write, and I was just like possessed. And when that happens, you don't actually have time for research. So I had a research assistant, and one thing I asked Andy Marlowe to do is to give me all the environmental sites in North Florida with African American and colonial sites mapped on top of them, plantations and everything too. She could not find a central database for that. So you talk about unknowability. She could find the fragments of that, and she could put it together and create, something in Google that gave me an approximation. But she couldn't find all that information in one place. And in some cases, she had to use satellite photos to show, oh, there's a ruin here that looks like it definitely this was part of a plantation near the coast. Maybe a failed one. Maybe it was only there for 2 years. But she actually did some historical research that seemed fairly obscure. And so I guess what I'm saying is, like, even in the totality of the place we live, there's not always that information or that knowledge of the history of the place. And the reason that I had them do that is because for every setting I use, I need to know the drill down history of that particular building, that setting, that beach, even if it doesn't come into the scene.
To honor it.
To honor it, right. To honor it, to know it, so that if there's an opportunity to layer something in, not in like a didactic way, that it's still there, somehow.
That is incredible. Let's pivot just a bit to something that we can all see.
Yeah.
And that is the cover art. Your cover art for your career has been incredible. But especially for this trilogy, like this abstract, mangled poetry of biodiversity that kind of stitched together. Let's talk about that a little bit. Do you choose it? Does somebody choose it for you?
I actually do choose it. Like, I have final approval on all the covers. Sometimes I don't have to exercise it. Sometimes I do. So, for example, the original Annihilation cover in 2014 was a chia pet looking outline of a boar with a very unfortunate snout that looked like something else from a distance. And I had to say no to that. On the reissues, it was kind of funny, and I feel bad because like the graphic design team is really great over at the publisher, but for some reason they gave me an image of a really buff frog holding a knife for the cover of Annihilation.
That's my family seal.
well, yeah, that's why they did it, I'm sure. But yeah, so it was a little disconcerting. So every once in a while, but these covers are actually by this guy Pablo Delcan, who takes these old naturalist drawings in the public domain or paintings, and he morphs them. So I love that idea of the old stuff, the history of that being brought into these books, and kind of given a modern or surreal twist.
If that's not one of the themes of your writing, I don't know what else. Yeah.
And then to finally like just be, direct, like, you would expect there to be an alligator on the cover of one of my books, right? So finally, I gave in. It's like, it's not a cliche. It's done in a way that's, interesting.
Well, let's talk about that. The cliche, I imagine that you were talking about the fact that a lot like William Faulkner has signified Southern antiquity writing, you kind of signify in this odd universe North Florida writing. Is it true that the St. Mark's nature reserve inspired a lot of what we're seeing in the imagery of your work through your words?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, every single detail of the natural or human world, whatever you want to call it, is firsthand observation in these books. I'm very proud of that. There's not a single thing that I haven't observed. The uncanny elements are obviously from the imagination, but and so there's a 14-mile hiking trail out at St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge that inspired Annihilation, and that's probably the funniest part of the story. Is after having dental surgery and being kind of out of my mind on the painkiller drugs, I came up with the idea. I wrote the novel literally over like 6 weeks. Like, people sometimes ask me, how do you write a New York Times best-selling novel? And I'm like, have dental surgery, have the drugs not quite work right, and then in a fever dream just write something for 6 weeks, which is not the way you're supposed to do it. But anyway, the point is, I handed it to my wife, and I said, what is this? Is this a novel? Is this just about 4 women wandering around a landscape? Because I didn't know at that point. I didn't know if I should even send it to my new agent or not. And Anne thankfully said, send it to your agent immediately.
So let's talk about that phenomena. There are times, well, I guess you just admitted to it, there are times where you don't know how good you are, or you don't know how prescient or powerful something is. What does that feel like to a writer?
I think there's a thing with me where I'm driven to write the most organic, personal thing I can. And I'm not saying that that's not a phenomenon natural to all writers, but there's something so secretly autobiographical about my fiction that sometimes it's difficult to know whether it's something that readers will enjoy or not. And thankfully, I tend to, even in the most surreal ones, try to find the structures or the plots or whatever to affix these fantastical images and situations to, that I do wind up writing things that people want to read. But it's not immediately apparent to me, and it's not immediately why I wrote something necessarily. I was driven to write it. Like with Absolution, probably the most intense writing experience of my life, I again was driven to write something that my editor didn't even know was happening. It wasn't under contract. It's just after a few months when I knew I was just about going to be done, I was like, I have a 4th Southern Reach novel, and I'm wondering if we could publish it next year.
You didn't even tell them during the process.
Not the beginning of the process, because I didn't know. Like, I was, it's hard to describe. Like people don't want to necessarily talk about like the inspirational process of it, but for me, it is very subconscious at first, and then mechanical in how you revise and everything. But so you don't know what you've got. You're in the grips of a vision, and you don't know if that vision is going to turn out to be great or not. But you just know you have to write something, and you're not even thinking about it. You don't even remember some of the scenes you wrote. You don't know how they came to you. You don't remember writing them. And so in that kind of a fever dream of writing something, you do hold back from telling your editor right away, in part because it's superstitious. Like you don't want to like jinx it. Like you're in this groove, right?
Yeah.
And like anything you might change could change it. So you get very superstitious. It's like,
Did you see what I did there, Jeff? I
what?
didn't mean to cut you off.
No,
I
no, no,
said
no.
jinx at the
Jinx.
same
Oh.
time you said jinx. You know, that's just the trick of the trade.
Right. Yeah, thank you.
I'm the Jeff VanderMeer of radio.
You were
yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, if so, then I expect something uncanny to happen pretty soon. But yeah, so it's something that is hard to explain when you're in the middle of it, but it makes it difficult to get perspective.
So, Jeff VanderMeer, global phenomena, global asset, local treasure. Both of those worlds are going to combine in what is a pretty massive book tour for this publication.
Yeah. It's from October 22nd until November 25th, I'm on the road. And for that kind of a book tour, you actually train ahead of time. I'm going to be consciously trying to lose 5 to 7 pounds right before I go on the trip, so that if I gain it back, it doesn't matter. And I'm going to have a very strict schedule for myself. And I'm going to enjoy the heck out of it, but only if I can, in a weird way, be kind of rigid about certain things, because I'm not a kind of person who does well from like staying up late every night and things like that. So I'm gonna enjoy it in a kind of like I guess I don't want to say like 50-something way, not like when I was in my 20s, I guess. But it's a good sign. It's a good sign they're sending me on such a long book tour. So.
Are any of the places, because this is going to be in the U.S., Canada, and the UK, are any of these places that you will situate in places that you have already been for book tours? Are you revisiting any of the same bookstores or facilities?
Yeah, some of them, like for example, Portland, Oregon, Powell's Bookstore in Portland. I would say it's kind of funny. Per capita, maybe it's different, but the most number of books that have been sold of mine are in the Portland area, in the entire world. Like I could potentially have a career just off of sales in Portland. So, and or here, but I'm saying it's like, yeah, here to some degree, but it's a smaller town, right?
Sure.
So some places I'm very familiar with. A lot of places they've booked are like larger auditoriums and things, which is a good sign. But I haven't done those kind of venues, so it's interesting performance wise. I prefer the larger venues. I prefer to be on a stage. It allows me a little more latitude. I'm not quite a stand-up comedian, but I do like that interaction with the audience. I like to have some banter back and forth. So that'll allow that to happen a little better.
So, diving back into the pages of the book.
Yeah.
I am not above the cliche, and you just do not get out of an interview with Jeff VanderMeer without talking the theme of climate change and how it resonates through your work and through your life in large effect because of the work that you do personally. So let's talk about that a bit. And again, I hope I'm not stepping out of line. Most people would consider climate change the main themes of your books. I kind of disagree. I think maybe it's the bad poet in me, but I think it's kind of like a truth-seeking. But for it being climate change, why does this decorate your pages overtly and covertly so often as an issue?
Well, I think that it's all around us. It's kind of like when I read a contemporary novel about, say, relationships in New York City, if it doesn't include something in the backdrop about weird weather or something that's contingent about climate change, it's kind of not telling the truth about what it's like to live in New York City right now, right? So it's kind of, first of all, I feel like it permeates at least the background of every novel now, unless it's set in like, the 1700s or something.
Are you saying that happens, or is that something you would like to see?
I would like to see that.
I see.
And so I guess what I'm saying is that it just comes naturally that if I'm going to write a novel set in the last few decades or present day, it seems like it's going to pop up anyway. And then the other thing, though, is not directly. Like, I don't like preaching to people in novels. I mean, that's what you have essays for and lectures and stuff like that. So usually it's about making people feel in their bodies some kind of effect of climate crisis, right? And not even necessarily in the Annihilation books so much as in books like Born, where someone's trying to eke out a living as a scavenger in kind of a post-apocalyptic setting. But if you really think about it, there's people who have to live that way today. It's just that it's unevenly distributed. And so that's one thing I also look at when I look at novels like set in that space. It's pretty clear who hasn't thought about that and who has. I mean, I once read a post-apocalyptic novel where a woman unironically was nostalgic for when she could like drive a gas guzzling SUV again when civilization came back. That's somebody who hasn't really thought about what it's like in the world for people who have already been affected by it.
And the implications. It's interesting you said that,
Yeah.
because speaking of climate change permeating and being
Yeah.
kind of this catch-all thing,
Yeah.
people so often, and rightfully so,
Yeah.
box it into an environmental issue,
Yes.
which I suppose it is, but
Yeah.
it's just not that. It's
No.
just as social an issue
Yeah.
as anything else. The demographics it affects, the
Yeah.
people that it's affecting, at rapid rates.
Yeah.
It can be a racial issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
No doubt about it.
Yeah.
And so I really like your answer that and I've never thought about it that way. How could you write a present day book, a book about any level of modernity without including it in
Right.
some way?
Yeah, and it's also because we get used to it. We get used to a higher and higher level of whatever, right? It is, whether it's weird weather or something else. And then there's other things like this is kind of tangential, but I think it matters. Like they just completed a study that in areas where where bat populations have crashed, infant mortality rates are higher, much higher, and it's because without the bats, the insects are much more prevalent and the pesticide use is off the charts, and the pesticide use affects the birth rate and the infant mortality. And so there's a lot of things about the way the world works that are kind of invisible to us, and the effect of what we do doesn't seem to kind of register. And so, you talk about how it's like, the human and non-human world are connected. It's not just through the fact that we've created this climate issue. It's also that we don't understand how biodiversity is connected to that. We don't understand, because we can't quantify it economically the way we do other things, just how many services the non-human world provides. And that's one reason why North Florida is so amazing, that we still have a lot of that. I mean, we're destroying a lot of it, but, it's actually stuff that's doing services for us. Like the other day, I was at this restaurant, and they had just taken down a stand of oaks to put in buildings. And basically, because they had done that, there was a ton of flooding coming down from the rain yesterday from that area, because there was nothing to hold it back anymore. And it was flooding out the restaurant, like literally on the floor. And things like that. And that's an example for me, first of all, because the kind of rain we get now is not the kind of rain we got 10 years ago.
Absolutely.
Right? In the summer, it used to be like this gentle rain in the afternoon. Now we get that sometimes, but mostly it's like a mini drought. And then we get this torrential, like, I don't even know, angry rain, right? So that's the kind of thing that I think about with regard to your question.
And I guess I said that that those things could be mutually exclusive, but they're really not. I guess if a theme is a search for truth and climate change, those things aren't mutually exclusive at all. So I just wanted to edit myself with that.
No, but you're absolutely right that I don't believe a novelist, at least this is the way I've always thought of novelists, is you're not meant to be topical. You're supposed to try to find the universal thing, or the right level to talk about something where whatever you're going to talk about is going to last, that your novel isn't going to seem out of date in 10 years. So, for example, in Absolution, there's something that happens with regard to one of the characters that's basically like modern day ghosting, and it's even called ghosting in the thing. But really what it is the theme is about abandonment and our fear of abandonment. And so when I started thinking about, I'm putting this modern thing in there, it's like, well, actually what I'm doing is this is the theme I'm exploring. I'm not topically exploring ghosting. I'm how we all have fears of abandonment or rejection or whatever else.
Yeah.
And so really it's how you think about it and then how you express it. And the other thing is that I don't use names a lot of places and
I've noticed.
And I do that because I think that conveys a more timeless feel. Like, again, it's not going to be out of date in 10 years because a place name is wrong or something
doesn't exist
or doesn't
anymore.
exist. And it also allows me, in a weird way, sometimes when I'm talking about like small southern towns, it's more universal because I can apply like a hybrid of different places I know. Whereas if it was a real place, I would feel real obligation to get all the historical details correct. I wouldn't feel comfortable being sloppy about it.
Like you were talking about earlier with honoring spaces and honoring places.
Right, exactly.
It's serendipitous that you said that you use that word, because that's the perfect segue to my next question, which was going to be, in Absolution, did you feel yourself using any new themes that you hadn't used in any of your previous works or in the trilogy before it? Or was it so natural that after you read it, you saw like we will see when we read it?
I think there's one thing that readers haven't seen as much because there's so many other things going on in the books, but I truly believe this, that there's a lot of honor in trying to follow what you might call beneficial imagination about the place we live in, and not succumbing to a, say, dominant imagination about the place you live in that's actually faulty or malignant. Yeah, so you see this even, I mean, without bringing it up too specifically, like in local politics, really what you see are candidates expressing a certain imagination about what a place should be. And some of them are very beneficial for communities and some of them aren't. And some of them are disguised in such a way that they seem like they are, but they aren't. And so when you exist in a system, especially that's dysfunctional, like I think sometimes, unfortunately, we do in the U.S., or a series of dysfunctional systems, it's an act of heroism to continue to try to see a vision of the world that is better for people, right, in general, and not just a selfish vision of the world. And so I see the characters in Absolution many times as struggling to keep a sense of self through having this vision of how the world can be, despite all of the systems and other people that are trying to stop them from doing it.
You have been reading my notes because your segues are perfect. The next thing that I was going to bring up was the fact that as I was doing some peripheral research for the interview, I came across an article that was a great article, very well written. This is no disparagement on the writer. But the title I thought was perfect. When I read the article, it didn't explore it in the same ways that I thought it was. It was still a great article, just not what I thought it was going to be. And they call you in the New Yorker the weird Thoreau. Right? And when I saw this, I was like, somebody hit it right on the head. Because he really is, or Thoreau really is, Jeff VanderMeer in another universe. You guys exploring, like with Walden, he's talking about the natural. And then with civil disobedience, he's talking about institutions and bureaucracy and government apathy and overreach. And you kind of merge those worlds too, you know, with authoritarianism or authority. Also with, you know, this North Florida backdrop. And I know that, and I shouldn't just keep saying North Florida because I do know that you imagine other places in these backdrops too. But since we're a local show, absolutely. Let's talk about that a little bit. The melding not only of these two themes, but how you exist as a man. Is the authority or the caution of authority something that interests you?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think a writer is meant to critique systems in part. And that means all systems. That means critique their own belief system, right? So for example, I am not particularly religious. My parents were basically Buddhist too, which is kind of like a religion that's not a religion in some ways in terms of its expression. It's like there's no centralized.
There's some philosophy.
There's philosophy, right? There's philosophy more. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but you know, and it's actually like interestingly intertwined with Hinduism and other things, depending on what part of Asia you're in. But my point is simply that, like, when it came to write a Christian preacher in Acceptance, you know, my hesitation was I need to do a sincere portrait. I can't do a caricature. I can't say because I come from a different background that I'm going to do a character that is somehow not three-dimensional, whatever. So I guess what I'm saying is that I'm trying to, when I inhabit characters, I'm questioning my position relative to them when I write them, so that I don't somehow unbalance it towards something that I personally favor or prefer. So there's that, but then there's also, I'm sorry, I lost the question.
Well, I thought it was a great point. So the question was exploring these themes of authority. And before you finish that, I thought that it was so grand that you placed that you brought up Hinduism. And in the Upanishads, which is, you know, this ancient Hindu text, there is a word, tatvamasi, that means you are it. What you're seeing now is reality. And what you just said about, man, you take such care of your work, not making a caricature out of something that could have very well
Right.
been a caricature. As a matter of fact, in popular culture, is only a
Right, it
caricature.
is, right?
Yeah.
Evil preacher, the
Yeah,
whatever you want to
exactly
call
right.
it.
I
Yeah.
thought that was so
Yeah.
grand of you. But yes, my question was going back to authority and how you see it and how it plays into your work.
Well, there's a couple of different answers to that, and one is that I grew up with my dad being an entomologist and chemist with a running a lab, a USDA lab for that in Gainesville, and he does great work. But there was also all the politics of the scientists, and I very quickly began to learn that there's an inherent bias in anything that human beings do. And so there was all this like power play dimension to his lab and writing papers and people's names being affixed to them that had nothing to do with science, right? But affected the science to some degree, right? So that was interesting. And then I had various day jobs with a contractor who worked for the state. So like for 9 months, all I did was go to county health departments across the state, driving to them and documenting their systems. And when you see like all these county health departments at that time with different systems and with like having to go through 12 screens to immunize one child with one shot, you begin to doubt that the systems have been set up in a way that makes sense. You begin to doubt the authority of the kind of like essential, almost invisible infrastructure that that rules our lives, right?
Sure.
And so a lot of the stuff in Authority, the second book about government agencies, is really pulled from my experience there. Like I actually did, go into a contractor job where there was a dead rodent in my desk. And I did actually go into another location where a guy the first day popped his head into my office and said, "Do you want to see a strange room?" like happens in Authority. And of course, it's the first day. I said no. If it had been the last day of the job, maybe, but so there's a lot of like stuff about that destabilizes your view of what's logical, right? What's logical, how we, you see like $1 million spent in a certain way because like one guy didn't get his caffeination that morning, what I mean, before the meeting. And then you realize, oh, there's a lot of decision making that we think of as logical. So it breaks down not just to authority and the idea of systems, but then at the local level, the individual decisions we make that we popularize as being logical often have some other component.
Absolutely.
Someone's going through a divorce, someone, and then suddenly the whole tenor of a project changes,
And
right?
sometimes it's not just overreach. It's the opposite, which is apathy.
Apathy, exactly, right.
Yeah.
You're just going through the motions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So those things definitely, I think it's important to kind of expose those things and kind of examine them. In part also because sometimes in addition to being terrible, they're very funny. One thing I do like a sense of humor in my work, and it's not something that people think of when they think of the Southern Reach, but Authority is I hope a very funny novel about government dysfunction.
Sure. The reason that I appreciated what you said so much about the preacher is because I was raised by a Southern Baptist preacher. And he is in no way the caricature that people display.
Exactly.
And even though I have my own traditions and my own way of thinking, I just appreciated what you said about that. And to go even further, well, you know what I think? We've got a fifth Southern Reach novel, Apathy. It's
Apathy,
an A
right.
word. You can give me credit for it, right? We can feature
there
my
you go.
dad.
That's exactly. There you go. Let's get writing with this. So what are we doing here? So
I know that this is the most low-hanging fruit question that you could ask an author, but you're such a splendid fruit tree that I'm going to pluck from it. Are there any themes, or is there anything that you want to write that you haven't written yet? I saw Toni Morrison tear Charlie Rose a new one over asking this question, so I don't want to get beat up, but might we see a Jeff VanderMeer self-help book? Or
No, not necessarily. I mean, I do have one for writers called Book Life. It's actually kind of self-help for writers, but I think I'm mostly within the sphere of novels, definitely. Like I've always wanted to do a series of novels that, as like a side effect, build up kind of your view of society. And it's not like this, but like The Wire, how it like dealt with the school system one year, and then one year it was something else, and so on and so forth.
A Russian doll,
right?
Yeah.
So, like building up those layers of systems, and so I'm working on a series of novels about a strange architect, that one of the side effects is that it has, I joke about this, but like one novel is really about the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008. But it's like I think very uncanny, unstabilizing, destable, but that's a side theme, you know what I mean? So it's like, what are things that people don't normally think of as being novel material, but like they are, because they affect people's lives, right? Like, it's systems. So really there's systems I haven't explored that I want to touch. Yeah.
I love that. So Jeff, in closing, the obvious that I want to say is, not only thank you for being you, but thank you for being local. Thank you for decorating our space with these phenomenal works that will live on, forever, quite honestly.
Oh, well, that's kind.
And, we know that Absolution will be probably the final word of the Southern Reach, but we are just looking forward to whatever new word you put forward next. We appreciate you so much for joining us. Is there anything that you would like to add in closing?
Just thank you very much for some thoughtful questions. And I will say one thing about Absolution.
Yes.
When I saw the albino alligator in the movie, I knew I had to try to one-up it. And that's kind of probably what happened with my imagination in creating this giant alligator called the Tyrant, who actually at one point is able to kind of write poetry. So,
well, just so people know, the alligator that you're referencing is in Annihilation, the movie, right?
It's in, sorry,
absolutely,
yeah. The albino alligator. Sorry, when I saw that in the movie,
Natalie
I knew.
Portman did a number on that alligator.
Yeah. And I remember because the director said he was going to use an albino alligator, and I said, there's never been a movie that's any good with an albino alligator in it. And he said, well, this will be the first one.
You've given me a perfect way to close out. While Gina Rodriguez is holding that alligator's mouth, she says, this mouth is getting heavy, and my mouth is getting heavy. I've talked too much. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeff.
Thank
we
you.
will see you all next time at home. Thank you for joining us again. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
That was great.
That was great. Thanks. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.